Hello and welcome to the help video for the Year 8 Hazards, Causes, Impacts and Responses assignment. The first thing you want to check is when your assignment is due. Right now this assignment is due in week 8, term 1, but that might be different depending on what your teacher says. So what are you going to be doing? Well, basically you're going to investigate a geomorphic event, what caused it, what its impacts were, and what you would do about it if you were in control of that area. Alrighty, we'll come back to some of these other sections, but I'm going to use this video to give you some help to make sure you do really well in this assignment. Included in this help video will be some instructions for how to read a rubric correctly as well. You'll find that your teacher has put a template for the report into your Google document. The template is essentially just this assignment sheet with all the text in blue, but we'll talk about that a bit later. Okay, so let's get started. Step 1 is you should choose one of these 4 different hazards or events. Please don't pick an event that's not on this list because your teachers have deliberately picked these 4 because they're quite different. You only need to pick one of them. All right. You'll notice that the context for these events is quite different. You've got rich countries, developing countries, rural, cities, a decent mix, and the context can be really important when talking about what the impacts of that disaster were on the people living around there. Okay, so I'm actually going to do something a bit strange. I'm actually going to skip the introduction bit, and we'll come back to that at the end. And I hope that you'll agree that that was a good idea in the end. All right, so first things first, what happened? We want you to do in part B a process of discovering data and finding evidence. And we want that in 2 different forms. We want you to build a data table, and in that data table we want you to include things like casualties. Now by casualties you have people who are injured and you have people who are dead. They both count as casualties. Now you might want to make sure that you differentiate and show us how many people were injured and how many people were killed from the event. The seismic data, how many points on the Richter scale was it, or what was the destructive force of the event itself? The latitude and longitude, basically where this thing took place. The elevation, and by that we mean the altitude of the place where this event happened. And that can be really useful, and we'll get to that in a moment. The climate, a climate graph that includes annual average rainfall and annual average temperatures. Now be careful, because a climate graph is a quite specific tool for geographers that shows the rainfall and the average temperatures for each month of the year, and that also can be very helpful. Whether the event happened in an urban or, say, rural part of a country. The population density. Now what we mean by that is the number of people per square kilometre. And to give you an example, Australia and China are more or less almost the same size. China is actually slightly bigger than Australia, just in terms of kilometres, in terms of square kilometres, how big it is. And yet, Australia has 24 million people and China has 1 billion people in it. 1 billion people is 1,000 million people. We have just 24 million people. So our population density is quite low compared to China. To give you another example, in Shanghai alone, there are as many people as live almost in the entire Australia, in all of Australia. So people are packed in. GDP, or gross domestic product, this basically is an assessment of how rich a country is. When you tell me, for example, that Nepal has a GDP of, let's just say something like $17 billion, when you give me that number, I think it's important that you also tell your teacher, how does that compare to, say, Australia or America, just to give us a sense of relativity. Is this essentially a rich country or a poor country? All right. So you have all these numbers, and the numbers on their own aren't necessarily very useful. What you're going to do in this section is explain what the numbers tell you about the event itself and the human impact. You'll have to use this as evidence. When you explain these things here, you'll have to say, quote statistics or numbers from this section that back up your point. Let's take rainfall, for example. You can imagine that a huge amount of ash and dust that falls from a volcano, for example, the one in the Philippines, the Mount Pinatubo eruption. If that's also a very rainy part of the world, then that can create a whole range of other problems. How do people get access to these devastated parts of the country when the roads are all turned to mud and slush from the heavy rainfalls? And what might that do to the rescue effort as well? So you're going to use these raw numbers to explain what happened and also explain the human impact. Alrighty, on a very similar theme, we want you to collect, say, 2 or 3 photos of the event. These can include before and after photos, maybe even an embedded video of the eruption itself, or a photo of the eruption, or a photo of an affected town. There's probably lots of other examples that we haven't included here. And what we want you to do is analyze and explain what the photo can tell you about the event and its effects. Now, an obvious example might be, a photo of the eruption and the gigantic dust cloud going into the sky. And those are very normal photos from volcanoes, of course. But we'd expect you to then say, as you can see in this photo, a tremendous amount of dust, and you might actually know the number of tons of ash and dust from some of the statistics that you collect over here. You might say, it was sent into the sky. This eventually, was blown towards maybe this other town. You might have a photo of an affected town. You're basically using these photos as a source of evidence. You're going to explain what that evidence can tell you. All right. Part C, we're getting a bit geeky and nerdy here. We want you to create a Google map. Now, we've got instructions here. Click on the hyperlink. We've also got an example of a crisis map from the earthquake in Christchurch, New Zealand. We want you to use your Google map, and you're going to share it with your teacher to show where the event happened. Where were the major impacts of the event? Now, an example might be in the Tohoku earthquake that caused the tsunami in Japan, where the actual earthquake took place was not on land, obviously, but it did trigger a tsunami, which did have impacts in different places, right? So your map will show us where the event happened, but also where the impacts were mostly felt. You might also include where there might be help stations, all right, or anything else that's relevant. And this is actually a bit of a hint, because in part D, you're going to tell us what you would do differently. But let's just work our way through this. So we want you to describe and analyze your data from part C. Now, I've actually hyperlinked the words describe, and I'll just click on this link and you will be able to see what we mean, because we've actually defined what these terms mean. Be very careful, because describe means to tell what something is like, provide details about the characteristics. Explain is something a bit different. All right, give reasons for something, why something happened. Look for cause and effect. And you would have had some practice in this when you're doing your data and your photo component too. These bits will be in paragraph form, at least one paragraph doing each one. This next bit's a little bit of fun. I want you to come up with realistic strategies that you would put in place if you were the governor or the mayor or the president of this particular country. We want you to do it in 3 phases, and I'll tell you what I mean by that. So one of those phases is many years before the event, one's just after the event's happened, the day after that is, and one's about a month after. When we talk about many years before, of course, many people around the world live on fault lines, or they live near a volcano, and you don't have to be, the smartest person in the world to know that eventually, at some point, maybe in your lifetime, maybe not, that earthquake will come, or that eruption will happen, and there'll be some gigantic and cataclysmic impacts on your life. So if you were the governor, what would you ask people to do to prepare for that event, knowing it's going to happen at some point? Now, be careful. We want you to keep things realistic. No one's allowed to start handing out free helicopters for everybody to escape. That's just not realistic. So we want you to tell us what you do many years before the event. Then we want you to tell us what your priorities are one day after the event. And we also want you to tell us what your priorities are 1 month after the event. Now, I said before, this is a big hint. I think this is exactly the sort of thing that you could include in your map. Lastly, please include a bibliography. And if I were you, I would use the add-on EasyBib. Now let's go back to the introduction. Once you know all your facts, I think writing your introduction and hyperlinking will be much easier. Anyway, I hope that this has helped you with this assignment. Good luck.